Hey everybody, today we're going to learn how to solder. So before we do that, we have to get acquainted with the soldering booth area. Here you can see there is the tripod and mesh, the fire brick, and the third hand that we're going to be using. We can also see that there's flux over here, as well as steel tweezers, there's the quenching bucket, and there's actually strikers and tin snips in this other bucket. As we go into here, you can also see that there is a light that you can turn on and off that we're going to be using at different times. There are a few other things of which you need to be aware before we start learning the different types of soldering that are common to most jewelry processes. You already know you need to use flux to keep the metal clean and to make the solder flow. However, you may need to reconstitute the flux if it has dried out. We try to prevent that by keeping it in Tupperware containers, but occasionally you will have to put about a teaspoon of water in the container and mix it if you can see it's not the consistency of Elmer's glue. You should also turn on the vents anytime you are soldering. The switches are under the cabinets above the counter on the right side of the sink in the back of the classroom. Once you are ready to solder, you can turn on the natural gas and air valves that are under each of the soldering booths. The reason we are creating the surface-to-surface solder sample is to learn how to solder two things together. Often you may be soldering a pierced piece on top of another piece of metal. Sometimes the metal will be textured, other times it won't, but the idea is to try to use minimal solder so you don't get solder on the bottom piece in areas that are inappropriate. For example, if you look at this solder piece, you can see there is solder on the textured area, which is a craftsmanship problem. This piece has solder on many areas of the textured surface to disguise what was a problem. I only mention this so you aim for the proper way to solder, but also realize that you can fix problems in unusual ways. It is very important to learn how to create this sample the right way so you don't ruin well-designed pieces later. There are two steps. In between the steps, you can create another solder sample or do other work. Do not sit around while pieces are pickling. When creating the surface-to-surface sample, you need a large square piece of brass and a small piece of brass. You can get the pieces from the counter near the sink in the front of the classroom or on the example table by the soldering booths. The instructor may move the location, but it will generally be in one of those two areas. Both pieces have to be completely flattened with a rawhide mallet and sanded on both sides so they are clean and can be soldered. Remember, right now all the pieces look the same and someone can claim yours if you don't stamp your initials into the pieces, so make sure that you do that and not in an area that's going to get covered. When you sand the pieces, remember you shouldn't touch them with your hands. Therefore, using a piece of sandpaper to hold the piece while you sand it with your other hand is recommended. Remember, you should be wearing safety glasses and tie long hair back when soldering. You should also not be wearing loose clothing. This includes hoodie strings. We don't want to accidentally set ourselves on fire. You also need to take process photos for your digital portfolio. I would suggest taking at least 4 for each solder type so you can choose what you want to show in your portfolio. Taking a photo during the process and another one when the solder is sanded at the end is a good idea. The first step for the surface-to-surface sample is to place the smaller brass piece on the tripod after you have fluxed it with the sanded side facing the ceiling. When you have the pieces set up, you can then sand the hard solder you'll be using. Then you will cut the solder vertically with the tin snips or aviation shears. Make sure you do not cut off the letter that tells you what kind of solder you are using, because you will need it again later. Remember, we are using hard solder first because it melts at the highest temperature. You should cut the solder vertically first and then use the tin snips to cut just a few pieces of solder onto the fire brick or into your tin so you do not waste solder. Pick up pieces of solder with the flux brush and use the tweezers to scrape the pieces onto the smaller piece of brass. Make sure the entire perimeter of the piece has solder pieces going all the way around it. Then dry the flux using a small feathery flame with little air. Remember, if the flame is too large, it will blow all the solder off your piece. You can also accidentally boil the solder off by leaving the heat on too long, so be careful. Once the flux is dry and the solder is solidified in place, heat the piece from underneath the wire mesh. The flame should be about a 1-inch cone flame. Any larger may make the solder pool in the middle and will cause problems for the next part. This does sometimes happen, so just do your best. Solder flows toward the heat, so if you keep the flame on an area too long, the solder will follow the flame and pool in the middle of your piece, or wherever the heat was the longest. Make sure you are not hitting the circular part of the tripod or you won't be heating your piece. This is why there are stools in the soldering area so you can sit to see underneath the tripod. The tip of the blue flame is the hottest part of the flame and should be touching the bottom of your piece of brass while you are trying to melt the solder. Once the solder melts, remove the flame right away. You can even blow gently on the solder to get it to cool. Remember, the solder is liquid when it's hot, so the air will cool it faster. As soon as the solder is solidified, remove the piece from the tripod and quench it. Flux turns to glass, so if you don't remove the heat fast enough, it may solidify to the mesh. You can wait a minute or two and pry the piece off, but be careful not to cut yourself from the glass shards left over from doing that. Once the piece is quenched, place the piece in your hand and take it over to the pickle. Put the protective gear on and place your pieces in the pickle with the copper tongs. There are a few very important things to remember about the pickle. First and foremost is that it's an acid solution that works best when it's warm, which is why we turn it on. It should be on either warm or low. It is also extremely important to cover the solution and to make sure it doesn't boil because the fumes are noxious, meaning that they can kill you. This is why the vent should always be on when we solder. Additionally, it's easiest to get the pieces out of the pickle when you use the draining pickle containers. There are small ones for smaller work and larger ones for larger pieces. More than one piece can go in the containers, so please make sure that you're sharing with your classmates. This is also why we're stamping our initials into those pieces. Generally speaking, it takes about 10 minutes to remove the fire scale created from soldering, but it may take longer than that if your piece was really black because you made some mistakes along the way or had to heat longer than you might have liked. When the top piece is pickled and completely clean, you can then solder it to the larger bottom piece. As long as you haven't touched the piece you already cleaned, you can flux it and place it on the tripod with the sanded side up. Then flux the smaller piece and place its soldered side, the silver side, down onto the larger piece. Dry the flux and use a large 2-inch cone flame to heat the piece until the solder melts. You should actually see the smaller piece lower onto the larger piece when the solder melts. Remember, you need to keep the flame moving in concentric circles to compensate the heat from under the piece until the solder melts. It may take a while to do this, so just be patient. If it doesn't work and you create a lot of fire scale, you may have to try again. You should be able to pickle your pieces and get it to work, but it's a good idea to ask your instructor to see if there's any tips or other problems that you're not thinking about. When the solder melts, you should see a glow all the way around the piece when it's done. Once the pieces are together, turn off the torch. Then pick up the piece and quench it in the water bucket closest to you. When the piece is quenched, place the piece in your hand and take it over to the pickle. You will have to pickle the piece again before you can file and sand to show the solder seams. Make sure you use the copper tongs and wear your protective gear when you are using the pickle. Once you remove the piece from the pickle, you can file and sand any excess solder off the piece, so your last process photo is of the soldered piece that shows just the finished solder seam. Then add the images to your digital portfolio so you can submit your work in Canvas. Remember, when you're done soldering for the day, you should follow the cleanup directions that are on the wall by the soldering booth to make sure that nothing is left in the booth and all of the gas and air are turned off.